Okay, good morning and slash good afternoon, and welcome to our South Carolina Ag Disruptors webinar series. I'm Kevin Burkett with the Clemson Extension Agribusiness Program, and this is our monthly series, and this is our sixth program, I believe. But our Ag Disruptor series is just a monthly series where we try to touch on topics that could have a significant impact on South Carolina agriculture producers. And we kind of have a wide range of topics and a wide range of speakers, but for today we have several presentations, and we'll go through those. But you can find our past schedule on our website, and we do try to record each of the webinars, and you can go back and watch those on our YouTube channel. But you can also see the webinars that are scheduled for the rest of the year. So this series will continue throughout the year until the end, until
I didn't get that.
December. So for today, we have Christopher Thomas, who is the state weather technician, and he's going to talk about the state weather project that Clemson has had going for the last little bit. We've got Brian Beer, who is a ag extension agent for livestock and is going to talk about forage production, and Matthew Fischer, who is an agribusiness agent and is going to talk about the cattle markets and input prices and things related to the economics of livestock. So before we get started, we do like to do a couple poll questions just regarding today's topics. And so there should be a question that just popped up on your screen. It just says, what is your level of knowledge on the Clemson State Weather Project? And if you'll just go ahead and select an answer for that. And it looks like everybody has participated. And we'll do one more. It says, what is your current level of knowledge on the rise of input prices? So it looks like everybody has participated for that. So we thank you. And at the end, we'll do kind of a follow-up question as well. But with that, so that we stay on schedule, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Christopher. We appreciate all of our speakers being on with us, but I'll go ahead and turn it over to Christopher.
Thank you, Kevin. Everybody see the presentation?
Yeah, it looks good.
There it goes. So my name is Christopher Thomas, and today I'm presenting on the Clemson University Cooperative Extension Service Weather Station Project, or as I like to call it, the CU Weather Project. This presentation was prepared by me and Zach Snipes down in Charleston. He's a horticulture agent down there in Charleston, and he kind of started this project, and then they brought me on to help get it going and everything. I am presenting outside today, so if anybody has trouble with me or anything, just somebody stop me, let me know, and I can speak up or move around or something like that. The reason that we started this project was to address the lack of weather data in South Carolina. A lot of times using a weather service like the Weather Channel or something, those services find the nearest Doppler radar weather station, which can be in Greenville, Columbia, Florence, and they extrapolate that information over your location, and there can be some error associated with that. So our project wanted to provide more more local weather information, as long as establishing a historical database that could be used for forecasting models and a couple other things that I'll get to in just a second. In terms of that local data, we also wanted on-farm weather data to be able to potentially look at some precision ag applications, for example, hooking up a weather station to a center pivot. So if the farmer could detect if he wasn't getting enough rain, the pivot could turn itself on and go and irrigate and some different stuff like that. Another big concern or another big initiative of this project was to look at climate resiliency, be able to respond and have more information surrounding events such as natural disasters, drought and flood events in the state of South Carolina. A few months ago, we were in a pretty bad drought. We actually worked with the climatology office here in South Carolina with Dr. Elliott to make a recommendation to the drought monitor and look at getting some of those counties classified as a disaster zone and some different projects like that. We're also monitoring frost and freeze events and sea level rise. And the big thing is with that historical database, if we could get it established, some of the things that we could do would look at historical comparison and looking at predictions and stuff. And based off of those predictions, we could potentially look at weather alerts or text and email to kind of give growers in the state of South Carolina a heads up that maybe the conditions are right for, a frost event or something, and they need to, do something to potentially protect their assets and everything. And then the last thing that we wanted to look at was helping out with some research, and I'll get to that later on in this presentation. So how this project got started is this picture that's on the screen right now was Zach Snipes took this picture when he was doing some research down at the coastal wreck, and they had a weather station there. I believe this is a Davis instrument, but the information on it was proprietary, and he wasn't able to give the information to none of his research assistants or anybody else there. And Zach kind of got the idea, wouldn't it be great to have access to, free weather information that was on site, on farm, and also have access to the historical database without having to purchase a login every time you wanted to share that information. So a proposal was drafted up by Zach Snipes and Blake Lanford and Dr. Matthew Burns, and brought to the extension leadership with a few initiatives. One was to establish a minimum of one weather station in all 46 counties of South Carolina. In order to achieve that, a full-time technician out in the field, that'd be myself, and a full-time web developer, because we're also going to look at routing this information into a centralized website, had to be hired. Another big thing was to establish an initiative to work with Clemson University research team and partners, basically to work with extension agents and stuff to find suitable locations in every South Carolina county to put these weather stations in, to get good coverage and also get them on the farms to satisfy the on-farm weather data. We also had an initiative to deploy more advanced ag flow stations at the rec location. That's primarily for research. I'll get to that. Like I said, towards the end of the slideshow, I'll elaborate more on that. And then lastly, probably the most important one, is once the weather stations were up, we wanted to develop some working teams and to come up with some different calculators and some different alerts and tools that the growers of South Carolina could use, and also develop some curriculum that could be used for weather awareness and hurricane preparation and stuff to that effect. The weather station that we looked at using is called Tempest by WeatherFlow. They measure rain, both accumulation and intensity, temperature index, humidity. They can measure lightning strikes, both the distance and how far away, or the distance and how long ago it occurred, and a pressure sensor in inches of mercury. This device has solar panels. It has black cells around it that are solar panels, and they can go outside. There's no cords or anything. It can be installed on a pole, and it sends a signal to a hub, which is placed inside of a building, and it's connected to the internet. And then it sends that signal to a kind of a cloud storage device. And the benefit with that is you don't have to be next to the station to access the information. All the information can be put on an API and can be pulled up on your phone. It can be pulled up on, that information can be routed to a specific website. You have options like that instead of having to go up to the actual weather station and download the data manually. Another interesting thing about these weather stations, and the reason that we chose them, is all the weather stations that we put up, and also the ones that were bought privately and installed privately, talk to each other as long as they have an open API. And they're also capable of talking to other weather stations that have an open data source. For example, DHEC has some weather stations around the state. The Department of Transportation has weather stations at some of the bridges around the state of South Carolina. There's the NOAA weather stations, the Cuckoo Ross, if any of y'all are familiar with that. And those are all open source, and the Tempest weather devices are able to use that information along with the weather station that we installed or the individual grower installed, and compress all that information to come up with forecasting models while simultaneously preserving the data at the instantaneous data at your weather station or the weather station that the farmer installed himself. And you can pull that up on that interface that they have. This is a picture of the interface that we have for the weather stations. So you kind of have a hub here at the top with temperature index and humidity, pressure, kind of your summary. Then you have your 7-day summary with the days that you can expand and get an hourly summary throughout the day. Like I said, it goes through 7 days, and you can collapse or open any of those days to get more granular information. And then this right here everything on this back page is forecasted. That's why I said it grabs all the open weather stations and brings that information in to come up with a forecasting model. But it has a secondary menu where you can view the data strictly off of your weather station. And they refer to it as instantaneous data. And it's the same thing. You have temperature, pressure, your lightning, your wind speed and everything. And they also can go down more granular and provide a graph. The Tempest devices, in terms of their rain measurement, are able to calculate intensity and accumulation based off the sensors they have on them. So for example, right here at 9:20, I believe this is 5-minute intervals. At 9:20, there was an inch of rain in a period of about 5 minutes. Because like I said, this is 5-minute intervals. And you can see with this line going across how the accumulation got higher and higher as more and more rain came in. So that's something that you don't get with necessarily all weather stations or like a rain gauge, because they measure how much rain you got, but you don't necessarily know how fast you got it. So that is the benefit with the Tempest weather station. This is another example of some of your metric breakdown. This is your wind breakdown. So this red line is your peak wind. You can see where the wind spiked a few times. And then you have your minimum wind and then an average. That's just another good example of how you can get a breakdown of the tools on this interface and everything. There's also some additional information at the bottom that's considered to be instantaneous data as well. Wet bulb temperature can be used in calculating evapotranspiration rates. We're looking at a few things, seeing if we can calculate that value. Air density, delta T. I know the wet bulb temperature is used by a lot of strawberry growers to know when to turn their heaters on or to cover up their crop to protect against frost damage. So that's some of the values that we can get with these weather stations. In terms of the implementation of the weather stations and how we went about getting the state covered, we used the Clemson extension service. So we have districts within our extension service, and we were able to basically tackle it in regions in terms of all the counties in the state, and work with the local extension agents to then find growers that extension agent has worked with on a regular basis and knows could use the data and would also be a suitable location. This is just a chart that I kind of used in the beginning to keep track of which counties we had and which counties we didn't. I wanted to put this in here just to show of how we kind of worked our way towards getting all of them. The upstate was especially a challenge because of some of the internet issues that we have up there. The internet in the upstate just isn't as good as some of the other areas of the state. And then this is when we got all of them finally covered. It took about, I think, 8 months for me to get them all out in the state. Zach put up the initial 12, and then I got the rest of them up. And this is the map of all the weather stations that we have deployed up to date. We exceeded the minimum of one of all 46 counties. There's actually 52 of them up, I believe. The reason for that being is some counties are a little bit bigger than the others, like Williamsburg and Aiken and stuff like that. And so some of those bigger counties double dipped, and we also located some of these stations at some Clemson facilities for research purposes. This kind of a breakdown of where we put the weather stations. Our main goal was to get these weather stations on farm, and that's why we decided to work with the local extension agents. And the majority of them, I believe it was 70 or 67% of them ended up being on farms and agriculture production. The next biggest category would be ag related. That's like fertilizer. We have a few of them at fertilizer places, stockyards, basically places where agriculture producers are likely to frequent, and they can have access to that information, or they can become aware of the project and stuff like that. And then the CU facilities, again, for research. And then the other would be some of them we put at schools. And the reason that we did that is to look at working towards that curriculum development and maybe bringing in some education in to schools about bringing awareness towards climate and weather resiliency. This is the website that we currently have developed. Like I said, we're able to get the information from all these websites, from all these weather stations, and feed them into this website and basically have like a hub where you can look at any of them. You can select the weather station that's closest to you, or you can enter your zip code and it'll find it for you. Eventually there will be a date feature where you can select a period between two dates, and you'll be able to look at the highs and lows and the amount of rain that happened between those two dates. We're also going to develop a calculator tab. Some of the tools we'll have in there will be growing degree days, chill hours, your highs and lows and your averages. And then we're also going to develop, like I said earlier, an alert tab, so you can sign up for weather alerts. if it's forecasted for you to have a tornado or something, we can potentially set up an alert that can maybe give you a heads up or something like that. The website was developed by the full-time web developer that we hired for this project. His name is Michael Alfonso, and he's working with Nancy Griffin, and I want to just take a second and give credit to them. They have done a lot of work in a very short amount of time. They really got this website going not long after we got all the weather stations installed, and it's come a long way, and I'm real confident that it's going to grow and it's going to become a very powerful tool. It just needs some time to develop those tools and get some more research and everything involved with it. Some of the next steps in this project are, like I said, developing those tools, your growing degree days, your chill hours, and those tools built into the website. And then we also are already moving forward with the climate and education initiative that we had on our initial proposal. There was recently a 4-H camp in Myrtle Beach that focused on weather awareness and hurricane preparation, having a family plan, an emergency plan, I should say, knowing where to go in case of an emergency and how to prepare for a hurricane. So we're already moving forward with that initiative. I mentioned research throughout this entire presentation. Some of the research that we're doing involves testing for variants. So we've installed some of these weather stations at Clemson facilities because we were able to install them next to some of the weather stations that we already have here. If, for example, we put some of them next to a Campbell weather station and a NOAA weather station, if any of y'all are familiar with those models. And basically we're looking for variants to see if there's any error, to be able to kind of check ourselves and make sure that we're on track and everything, and that our information is on par with the other weather stations that are currently being used today. Collaboration with partners, we're looking at working with a few other groups, as well as continuing collaborating with the groups that we already are. A big one is the Department of Natural Resources, specifically their climatology office. They've been a big help with this project, and we look forward to working with them some more. They're also going to help out with some of the calculators that we're going to develop. And then lastly is adding more stations. We're trying to get it set up to where we can add a station to where anybody in the state of South Carolina can add a station and potentially send their information in to our website and use our calculators. It would be mutually beneficial because we would have more coverage throughout the state of South Carolina, and the growers who are purchasing the stations would then have access to some of the tools and calculators that we would be developing. This is just a slide of some of our partners that we're using. Like I said, we work very closely with the climatology office underneath the Department of Natural Resources, and the 4-H and the FFA for the curriculum development, also NCRS and the NOAA weather stations, and then Farm Bureau. Going back to this is a picture right here is all the weather stations that have been bought, whether they are ours or somebody privately purchased one of these weather stations. And this picture is actually kind of old. And so this is why one of the things we're looking at is being able to have people purchase their own station and then send their information into the website, and then being able to use that tool, because we can get a lot more coverage than we could with just using our stations alone. That's all I've got. Unfortunately, I've got to go to another appointment today, but if y'all have any questions, please send me an email or shoot me a call or something. If I don't answer, just leave a message. I'm happy to answer questions and everything. I just don't have time to answer questions today, and I do apologize about that, but please shoot me an email or anything if you've got questions. And I also want to give credit again to Zach Snipes, Dr. Matthew Burns, Blake Lampford, Dr. Matthew Smith, and Dr. Kathy Coleman for working on this project. And then the two website developers, again, Nancy Griffin and Mike Alfonso. And that's all I have, Kevin.
Okay, sounds good. I appreciate it. And if you will, if you'll type your email and stuff into the chat, and that way, if people do want to get in touch with you, they can do it that way. So I think I did see a question come through Q&A, but we'll try to follow up with you following the webinar and everything. And given that we have kind of a shorter time frame for this webinar, probably with the other speakers, we'll kind of do the same thing, that we'll maybe just follow up at the end of the webinar or following today's webinar. So with that, we will go ahead and turn it over to Brian, and you're welcome to share your screen and touch on forage production.
Okay. All right. Well, appreciate the invitation to speak to the group today. I want to discuss a little bit about some of the things going on in the livestock world right now. A cattle perspective on all of these things that we have going on. Matt sent me some stuff. He wanted me to kind of go over the drought status, drought mitigation options, stockpiling forages, and hay stocks, hay availability, and hay pricing. So we'll touch on all of these as we go through this today. Start out with where we are with the drought status. As of this report that was released on the 11th from the USDA Drought Monitor, the state doesn't look that bad. We do have a pretty good pocket of abnormally dry, at least abnormally dry, and a little bit of moderate drought that's parked right over the top of our cattle producing area of the state. So it is affecting some of those areas, and it's a situation of that we're probably just getting enough moisture to keep things from getting worse, but we started out in such a hole that it may not. It's a little more complex than what the drought monitor map looks like. Just looking at the percentages, what the drought monitor is saying, you see our current week. 75% of states has experiencing no drought, and about 23% just abnormally dry, with 1.5% in that D1. So compared that to 3 months ago when we were back in May, and we had half the state that was at least abnormally dry, and about 23% of the state was in D1, and we had about 4% that was getting into D2, which is a moderate drought. So we came into the spring being dry, and we're just kind of holding our own. Go back to the start of the year, back at the end of December, and you can see that the vast majority of the state had abnormally dry conditions, and we had almost 23% of the state in D2, and 41% of the state at least abnormally dry, and only about 18% of the state showing none. So we started out dry, and the moisture that we're getting is helpful, but it's just kind of holding us pat. We're not gaining a whole lot of ground, it doesn't seem like. The bigger picture from a cattle production perspective is we're still dealing with a long-term drought that's happening out in the western part of the country. I like to call it the square and rectangle shaped states, mainly because there's a lot of cattle in those states, and there's been a pretty good sell-off of cattle in this area because of the dry weather, and that's affecting the supply, and it is having a driver on price, and some of that's beginning to show up in the futures, with looking ahead and seeing, with all that sell off, where the calf supply is going to look like, and so we're looking at tighter calf supplies, and Matt may touch on this with and some of the inventory reports do show that we're still basically in a liquidating mode right now, to where our cattle inventory is going down all over the country. So talk a little bit about mitigation strategies, and we may or may not be in a situation where we need to do some of these, but we'll talk about a few. I'm going to touch on some of the winter annuals. I'm also going to look at stockpiling forages. I'm going to cover that topic in this section. And another mitigation strategy we're just going to touch on right quick is actually the purchase of the hay, or hay alternatives and supplements that we may be needing to pick up. winter annuals it's a big part of the forage base in livestock operations. And it's an annual crop that we're planting, and our goal for that is utilize it for grazing. Sometimes we'll cut it for hay if we have a surplus. But most common things that we're going to be planting in South Carolina is going to be ryegrass, some of the small grains, rye, oat, wheat. Some clovers are becoming gaining popularity again with the increased nitrogen cost. Everybody's interested in integrating clovers and trying to help out and get some nitrogen fixation so that we can not have to buy quite as much nitrogen. And a lot of times we'll do mixtures of all of these, and those work pretty well to help fill those forage gaps. And that's one of our goals with these winter annuals is to fill in the forage gaps and make that production to where we can graze as much of the year as possible. There's some 365 days worth of grazing folks out there. That's a great goal to shoot for. The practicality of that actually happening is a little harder than they make it out to be. But getting as many grazing days as possible is going to help the operation, and we'll get into some of that in just a minute as well. But again, the biggest advantage of those winter annuals is increasing the grazing days that we have available. This is especially the case in Bermuda grass systems or warm season grass systems. These winter annuals have a pretty fast growth rate, which leads to a short rest period in between grazing, so we can graze them often and get a lot of growth out of them. All of these varieties that we're using now are adapted well to the Southeast and do well here. And it also gives us, like I mentioned before, the potential to graze them or to harvest the forage and keep it around as stored forage if we need it. Some of the disadvantages, of course, is that equipment requirements, especially if we're doing no-till and interseeding. We've got to have a no-till drill. We've got to have a sufficient size tractor. If we're doing clean tillage, then we have to have a tractor large enough to be able to work the ground, and a different planter to plant in that prepared ground. Fertilization required on these winter annuals is fairly significant, and with that, the high price of fertilizer right now, that is that is a little bit problematic. We're also going to have some grazing management to make these things work. And the biggest thing is when we plant these winter annuals, the animals are going to need to be somewhere else until we get sufficient growth to graze these winter annuals, and that may be holding animals off of an area for 2 or 3 months and letting that grass grow. These things don't work if we plant them right under the animal's foot and they have access to it as it's attempting to germinate and get started. We see that happen quite a bit. Touch on stockpile forages. Just what is that? And that's just allowing forages to accumulate and grow, and allowing the animals to graze it later. Sometimes we hear folks call this deferred grazing, and we may be weeks or months after pulling those animals off. It gives us the ability to graze during a time period of limited growth or no forage growth. We can graze stockpiled fescue during December, January, when normally the growth rate's pretty slow. But we can allow it to grow in the fall and have it available to us during that time when we know it's not going to be growing that well in the dead of the winter. And this stockpile practice is very commonly used in tall fescue systems. It's got some potentials in the warm season systems, but there are some challenges with that. And again, the biggest advantage of stockpile forages is extending those grazing days. And the good thing about using fescue in stockpile forages is fescue maintains its forage quality very well when we stockpile it. We can have fescue that is good enough to meet the nutrition requirements of dry cows, and occasionally we can get stockpile fescue that will almost meet lactating cow requirements. Some of those disadvantages, of course, is planning and management. We're talking about having to stockpile these grasses, and we're not going to get back on them for a couple of months. So we've got to plan out, where am I going to do this? Where can I do this on my farm? Do I have the ability to make sure the animals don't get back in there at some point? So you got to have pretty good fencing infrastructure to keep animals away from what you don't want them on, especially when it looks like they want to eat it. Challenge with stockpiling warm season grasses is, in general, we're going to have a little bit lower forage quality after dormancy sets in on those warm season grasses. And it'll be of a quality that will meet the requirements of your dry cows most of the time. But a lot of times on the warm season grasses, they're not quite going to meet the nutritional demand of a lactating cow. So be able to use them and reduce our hay feeding, but we're probably going to need to include some supplementation in that regime whenever we're looking at cows that have calves by their side. Talking about reducing these grazing days, and it all comes down to some of the cost. And this is a little bit older budget that hasn't been adjusted in a couple of years, but it's got a total cost down there of almost $830 to carry a cow for the year. And yeah, this budget is about 3 or 4 years old and hasn't been adjusted for the recent price run up. But most folks didn't believe us when we told you it cost $830 to carry a cow 4 years ago. And now it's, you may believe it, that it costs you that now. But it is going to be, it is costing us a good bit to carry these cows through the year. And we need to know what that is. I mean, this is a budget, and a budget is a guideline. You need to plug your own numbers in here and figure out what exactly your costs are. But the biggest thing I want to point out in this budget is, when you look at what the feed costs are in this budget and you add them all up, feed is 85% of the variable cost in this budget, and it's 47% of the total cost in this budget. So feed is a large expense, whether it be, and included in feed in that is growing the pasture that the cattle are going to be grazing on, growing the hay that you're going to store and feed them in the wintertime, purchasing that supplement that we may need, or most of the time will need, whenever we get into feeding lactating cows. So it's a significant part of the cost of carrying a cow through the year is getting her fed. And we need to look at some of the ways that we can try to reduce that cost. One of the ways is increasing the grazing days and reducing the number of hay feeding days. We'll get into hay cost a little bit later, but from that budget, when we look at it, it's the variable cost was $452 and the fixed cost was $367, and that gave us basically about $830 annual cow cost. You just do a simple arithmetic, and that's costing you $2.27 a day to carry that cow. If you wanted to tack on the recent 9% inflation of that, we're pretty close to $2.50 carrying that cow at about $2.47. So it's costing us that much every day to carry that cow. You saw how significant those feed costs were in the budget. The thing is, that cost is not evenly spread over the year. Most of that expense is incurred in the wintertime with winter feeding. So we've got that to deal with. And when we look at that winter feeding portion, and I'm making an assumption here that we're feeding 30 pounds of hay per head per day, and that hay's about $120 a ton, and we're feeding 6 pounds of supplement a day that's costing us $300 a ton. During that winter time, that we get $2.70 per day just in feeding cost. So that shows you that it is a pretty seasonal cost. And once we get out of winter, we have a lot of those costs behind us. Maybe 55 or 70% of our costs are behind us once we get out of winter and we're starting to graze grass. So that helps us the reduce this amount of stored feed that we have to put in through these cows is, increasing grazing days. And that's what we were looking at with the winter annuals and the stockpiling of the fescue. When we just look at feeding dry cows and just what they're going to be taking in on just hay, if that's all we're giving them, and again, using that 30 pounds of hay a day and $120 a ton of hay, that's $1.80 per day of hay cost. So, and you can see there as we go through 30 days of feeding, 60 days of feeding, 90 days of feeding, and so on, what that does to the cost that we have put in this cow. And if we can add 45 to 60 additional days of grazing, then we're going to reduce the cow cost by about $81 to $108, or we're going to reduce the hay cost by that amount. Yes, implementing some of these things that are going to get us additional grazing days have a cost associated with them, but being able to cut down on that hay expense is going to be a big help to the budget, because hay is a fairly expensive feed for us to have to use, even if you grow it yourself. Yeah, this is some of the information. One other thing that we can do as we implement some of these stockpiling and winter annuals is we can start to change our grazing practices some, from a continuous grazing where, we kind of just have a fence around the perimeter and the cows can graze the whole place and just go wherever they want to go, eat what they want to eat and not eat what they don't want to eat. And, you can see there with the amount of forage that is available out there at that, 2,000 pounds of dry forage per acre is a pretty good number. That a lot of our pastures will have that on it. But, just changing those ways of grazing to a moderate rotational grazing adds around 20 days worth of grazing just by changing how we do things, by rotating those cattle around. Implementing strip grazing can add additional days. So it's a benefit to maybe look at how we're grazing these cattle and how that can help us increase grazing days and get off of the feed bill of stored feed and supplement. And it's again, these things have costs associated with them. Fences cost money, but it really does help get us off of the hay bill by being able to increase the grazing days by implementing some of these grazing management strategies. That's one of the things I pointed out when talking about the stockpiling and the winter annuals is if they take some grazing management, and in order for them to be successful, and this is the kind of thing we're talking about. Look right quick at another option. You get these hay alternatives or supplements that we can purchase. And, if we're just feeding Bermuda grass hay to the mythical 1,100 pound cow that everybody says they have, that Actually, she probably weighs about 12 or 13. But, if she eats all the hay that she can hold, she's going to be consuming about 24, 25 pounds of hay per head per day. And you can see what her nutritional requirements are right there with a dry matter intake, pounds of crude protein and pounds of TDN that she needs in her diet. And you can see with this hay, we're short on energy, which is generally the case. We're going to be, a lot of times we're short on energy, not protein. So she's eating all she can, but she's probably still going backwards because she's not in an energy balance. One of, just a couple of things that we can do to look at stretching that hay supply is, cotton gin trash. If you're in an area that's available to you, that is a very good hay stretcher that you can get your hands on. And some, corn gluten pellets is another fairly available feed stuff that we have available in the Southeast from the corn syrup industry. And just by saying, okay, I'm going to feed 5 pounds of gluten pellets and I'm going to cut back my hay to 12 pounds and replace that hay with this gin trash. And we can get a balanced ration right there for that same cow. And at the same time, we have reduced the hay demand by 12.5 pounds a day per head. So in implementing some of these little strategies, look at these alternatives, throw in some soy hulls and the gluten, and you can reduce the hay and still keep that fiber level up there. And cotton gin trash is a good alternative because the cows really do like it. There's very little adjustment time to when you switch over to that. And it's a pretty good hay stretcher if you need to try to do that. And several gins are getting to where they're actually taking some of that gin trash and running it back through the cotton press and actually making bales of gin trash and marketing it. So that's available. If you can get your hands on it, that's a good way to stretch some of those hay supplies. The other thing to look at is the feedstuffs that we often use have a seasonality to their price. So if we know we got to have them, maybe we need to look at when we're buying them. Because if we need corn gluten feed as our supplement and we have a buying opportunity back in August when historically this is 2003 to 2012 data, but I think the trend is still there. We got a buying opportunity in the summer on these things. If we got the ability to store them, we can purchase them when they're going to be at a lower cost time of the year, and purchase them then. The same thing with the soy hulls. June, July is a downtime in that market. If we're waiting to purchase these until we get into fall, lo and behold, now we're purchasing them at almost the highest point of the year. When we get to buying these things in November and January. So if you've got some storage capabilities, look at purchasing some of these things during an off time of year. Cottonseed is one that you might as well wait and buy it when you need it, because we're going into fall and into winter, and that's historically a low time of year, mainly because cotton's coming off in October. And that's when the supply of cottonseed is going to be at the highest, is when the gins are running. And so that's one that we can purchase when we need it and still be at a low cost time of the year. Distiller's grain is another one that we can get our hands on. And again, buying opportunity in August and September on those. And so consider doing that. If you know you need something, plan ahead. And purchase it at an off time of the year, and be able to get your stockpile of supplement there at a lower price. Quick look at the hay stocks and hay pricing. This is the May hay stocks, and you can see there's the United States is about 7% down in hay stocks compared to this time last year. I draw to your attention all those southeastern states right there that are 20% lower, 34% lower. South Carolina's 36% lower. So we're liable to be in a time of tight hay supply as well. That's Weather probably has had something to do with that because of our dry spring. We didn't get yields that we thought we were. And with increased fertilizer prices, some folks weren't fertilizing like they were supposed to. And the yield was doubly affected by the dry weather and lower fertility. Yeah, look at what this hay is really costing us when we go to make it. Yeah, this is from some of the budget workup, and this one has been adjusted for the current prices. I ran this thing in I did this in June at a meeting, so this was the June fertilizer prices in June, and yeah, it's got high fertilizer and $5 diesel in here. And you can see right there on the variable cost, we're at $733 an acre, and on Bermuda grass yielding 5 tons an acre, that puts us at about $73 for the 1,000-pound round bale that everybody makes. You don't believe it, just ask them. But you know, we've got fixed cost in here too, and when we add the fixed cost to that, we end up getting a total cost of right at $87 a bale for the Bermuda grass hay. For you fescue guys, you know, we're looking at the variable cost at about $66 a bale. Your per acre cost is lower at $462, but unfortunately, this one has got, you know, the fescue yield at 3.5 tons to the acre, and that's pretty optimistic for our area. We're probably closer to 3 to 2.5 or 3, but at that lower yield, you end up getting that cost of that 1,000-pound round bale right at $66 on a variable cost basis. Throw in total cost, and lo and behold, you're right up there with the Bermuda grass boys at about $79 a bale. So that just, and you know, it's that I had in those other figures $120 hay, $120 ton hay, because I see some $55 and $60 hay for sale right now. So if you're in that hay selling business, we got some questions we need to answer. And my biggest question is, how much hay are we going to move at $80 a bale? That price point may shock some people out of purchasing hay. It may shock some people out of the business altogether if they have to purchase all the hay. But I mean, that's a legitimate question for the folks that are in the hay selling business and they don't have animals to use the hay. How much are you really going to move at $80 a bale, which is basically what our costs are? To combat that, do we take the short-term solution and ease our customers into this new high-price realm by pricing the hay just to cover variable costs this year? You know, that's a short-term fix. We need to cover total cost if we want to stay in business in the long term, but we need to really cover variable costs if we want to stay in business this year. And can you use your hay? If you got a use for that hay, I darn sure wouldn't cut loose with it for much less than $80 a bale, because it's worth that to me just to have it on the farm and be able to put it through my own animals. And you know, yeah, I'm not an economist, but I play one at work, and it's difficult for us folks with an economics background to talk economics to people that economics does not enter into the decision-making process that much. And our former forage specialist quoted a term called recreational haymaking. And yeah, at the price levels that we're seeing some hay sell for, I hope you're getting something out of it, because you're not covering cost. So I hope the value is some recreation or some entertainment value. And if you're a recreational haymaker, then what we have talked about doesn't matter. But for those of us that are in that business, this is going to hit us hard this year, and we got some tough decisions to have to make. All right, with that, that's what I have on my end for that. Kevin, turn it back over to you.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Brian. And maybe similarly, if you would put your contact information in the chat and people could follow up with you with any questions. I did see one question come through the Q&A. You might type out a response there if you wanted to. But we will go ahead and move to Matt Fischer for our final presentation. He's going to cover some market updates for us. We may go over just a couple minutes past 1 o'clock. So if people need to drop off at some point, that's fine. We understand that. We try to be timely, but anyway, we did want to get to all the presentations for today. But we'll turn it over to Matt.
Can you see the screen all right, Kevin?
Yeah, looks good.
All right, thank you. So thanks for joining us today, guys. So I'm going to kind of bookend and kind of tie, I guess, the previous two talks together with weather and the impacts that it's having on the cattle markets and the forage markets, as Brian mentioned. We'll start off. Let's see here. Start off just like a national overview. As Brian mentioned, we are in a liquidation cycle still. We're seeing cattle, we're seeing cows and calves shipping. It's nothing to be worried about. Typically, a liquidation cycle and expansion cycles happen, and it's just part of the nature of it. We'll also see some possible reasons why we're in this cycle. As Brian mentioned, and it goes back to a lot of the weather talk, 8 of the top 10 hay states are also our top 10 beef cow states. They include Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Nebraska, South Dakota, Kansas, Montana, and Kentucky. If you're geography major or took geography much, you know that's basically where that national map showed, where we're in those heavy drought areas. One thing that we're seeing also from marketing is that our beef cow slaughter was up 14.5, a little over 14.5% year over year in just the first half of this year. But the thing about it is that's following 2021, where we were 9% increase on cow slaughter. So we're seeing our cows make their way to the slaughterhouses as opposed to being in that reproductive herd. And also on that drought talk, CattleFax does a pasture and range condition index, which it's just an index, so it's more of a comparative thing. There's really nothing to these numbers but to compare them to themselves. So this week we were at 50.4 on the index, where last week we were at 50.6, so not really much of a drop off. 55 for last year at this time, but the real story is here is that 5-year average on the index. You can tell we're about 12 points below that 5-year average. So that's making some decisions hard or easy maybe for those heavy cow state or those heavy cow states on what to do. Kind of on that same note, where we are with demand for our meat index, our protein market, you can see that beef, both choice and fresh, all fresh, were strong first quarter on demand with this index. But we're losing positive traction as we came into the second quarter. We haven't had updated. This is a graph or a chart that Glenn Tonser out of K-State keeps going. It's just interesting to watch. We saw some real strong positive demand during the pandemic or the latter part of the pandemic, but I think we're starting to see some of that slide. We're seeing that pork has increased on the positive demand as a substitute, and likewise with chicken. Pork seems to have a little stronger movement with respect to chicken, but they're both kind of starting to gobble up some of that protein demand. One positive that we've got is our export market seems to be doing well. Right now, we're up 7.5%, a little less in comparison to this time last year. And to date, we've shipped 1.79 billion pounds out. And you can see the top 10 countries where we're taking that to: South Korea, Japan, China, Canada, Mexico, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Philippines, Indonesia, and the Netherlands. It's important to note where I have it highlighted in red, the geographic proximity to all those countries. So we're shipping a lot of it to that Asian market. But as the graph shows, the black line, solid black line, is the 2022 to date, and then obviously the dotted line, black dotted line, is showing what CattleFax and USDA is forecasting out for the remainder of the year, well above the dotted blue line, which is our 5-year average. So that's a positive note for our beef industry. Let's talk some down home numbers, get off the national and start looking more at South Carolina. One thing I like to do is I like to just track, and with the help of Brian, we share a pricing database that collects all of the marketing data for South Carolina. And what this is, these numbers are the statewide average for the sale barns in South Carolina. So there's not one individual market taken out, but these are USDA reporting sale barns. So we can see our 4 weights, sorry, that's 400 to 499 steers, medium, large, 1-2. We're at pretty much a 13% premium to the 5-year, which is nice. You know, we want to be getting more money for our calves. And the nice thing about these 4 weights and markets kind of pulling this trigger is we're following seasonality. So we're at an increase, we're at a premium price, but we're following expected price movement so far through the year. Our 5 weights, you can see they're not quite following that same seasonality trend a little bit. You see some inflated prices there in the late first, early second quarter. So we kind of stretch from anywhere from a 6 to 15% premium. And as I mentioned, we've got that little bit of unseasonal pricing built in on that market. And so we're going to go to the next one. This is where it's going to be interesting to see. So these are our heavier steers that we're marketing out of sale barns in South Carolina. And you can see pretty much started the first of the year off kind of following a trend with a premium built in. Had a little dip there in March on them, a little market signaling, and then all of a sudden they skyrocketed. So as of July, this pricing data, we're showing an 18% spread premium for the 6 weights. And, you know, it's hard to really forecast out past that for our local markets, but if the trend's going up, you know, it's a positive signal. So in regards to input cost, as Brian kind of hit on, we're going to go through what I call the 4 Fs, which is forage, fuel, fertilizer, and feed grains, and just kind of talk through some of that. Brian's hit on this, but this is more of a national look, what USDA has reported. 2022 hay production forecasted at 116.8 million tons. It's a lot of hay, but it's unfortunately down 2.9 from a year ago. And actually back talking averages, we're down 10% from the 11 to 20 average. So there's going to be probably constrained hay production, which is obviously, as Brian mentioned, is going to play an influence on price. And then total hay supply right now, not production, but supply, is reported to be down 3.4% year over year and is down 11% from the 10-year average. So this is what USDA is showing on the national level and really starting to kind of be indicative of what we're going to see coming into the winter months. And there's a reason I put the guys, the Amish or whatnot, bailing with a hitch, because obviously the next thing on everybody's mind is fuel prices. And this is data coming out of the Energy Information Administration. And we're seeing, starting about March, late February, March, fuel prices really starting to ramp up. And if you look at that time period between there and June, saw about a 35.5% increase on fuel prices. And the tricky thing to that, unfortunately, is that's when we're starting to kind of ramp up our hay production. Now, we see it kind of tailing off, what could be probably towards July 4th. And the latter part of this graph, we don't have that information available yet. But that's where the dollars and cents really hit our producers' pockets when they were going out there trying to produce their own forage. The nice thing, if there's any light at the end of the tunnel, is that historically we're going to see typically the lower winter month fuel prices. Travel season's kind of winding down post Labor Day. We hope to see some relief in those prices. Concurrently, fertilizer, that's another one that hit us real hard, especially in the forage production between hay and pasture. We can see this is a Bloomberg Green Markets Index, which they observe Gulf Coast urea, New Orleans DAP, diammonium phosphate, and they look at Corn Belt potash to kind of build this index. So this isn't pricing, but this is an index that dates back to 2002. So it kind of shows the pricing movement through the growing season so far to date. We hope to see fertilizer prices start dropping off a little heavier coming into the winter months. So we'll just have to watch that. But as of July 14th, USDA's reported anhydrous ammonia, which is 1,469, diammonium phosphate DAP 983 a ton, and 862 for potash. So those prices are still elevated, and they're still hard to make pencil out. So again, feed grains. This is the crop progress report, the crop condition index from USDA. And if you want to see, you can kind of go through the Corn Belt states and see we've got some that are above, which is good. The orange line is this year, blue line's 5-year average. So our corn crop condition looks good for the most part. You can see 94% silking, of course, 97 is a 5-year. That's crop condition as of yesterday. 62 for dough stage, 65 is the average, and then 16% on dent. So we're kind of right in there with our crop condition. However, we've got reported 89.9 million acres of corn, and that's down 4% from last year. So we'll have, definitely probably a result of high nitrogen prices put in with maybe rotation decisions, but we're gonna see less corn. So quick takeaways. We're in the liquidation cycle. As I mentioned, there's nothing to be overly concerned about with that. It's part of the nature of it. Unfortunately, I think it's exacerbated due to increased production costs. And then we are experiencing higher marketing costs here in South Carolina. So we're getting a little bit more for our calves. So when we have that coupled with, as we mentioned, dry weather or the climate conditions, it's going to make for some hard decisions. Like to end on a positive note. At least we see our exports are trending positive, at least for the predicted future, which is going to continue to give ourselves some good market, even though beef or cattle or beef production is losing a little bit of traction on the demand side to pork and poultry. As Brian mentioned, I'll drive the point home. If there's ever a time to start really sitting down and doing some budgeting, this is the time, and some long-term business planning, because it's easy to see the high prices and the high cost and sell everything you got, but that might not be the best long-term decision. And it might be. It's just that's when you have to sit down with pencil and paper and figure it out. So with that, I appreciate y'all's time today. And if you have any questions or comments, my contact information is listed.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, Matt. And we are pretty much at our schedule in for today. We are scheduled till 1, just a couple follow-up items. I was going to, if you don't mind, putting your contact in the chat as well, Matthew. And then I was going to put the weather link into the chat in case people were curious about that and wanted to look at that website. Our next webinar will be scheduled on September 21, and we'll have the Southern Dairy Business Initiative grants. And then Steve Richards from Agribusiness will be evaluating another business idea for us next month. You should get an email with the links for today's recording if you want to go back and look at that or share it with someone else. And if you think of any other speakers or topics you would like to hear from, that feedback is helpful for us too. So real quick, I will do a poll question, follow-up poll question. Just says, what is your level of knowledge on the Clemson State Weather Project following today's program? You can go ahead and respond there. All right, and then one more, we'll do, what is your level of knowledge on the rise of input prices following today's program? So we do appreciate you logging in with us today. And again, our next webinar will be September 21st from 12 to 1. And once you've registered for one webinar, you're registered for the remaining series. We plan to have some reminder emails and things coming through Zoom as well, just to give people a heads up for upcoming topics and upcoming programs. So With that, we are at an end for today, so we appreciate you logging in and hope you have a good afternoon.